Okay, so part two, I'm looking at a particular case study on the English riots in 2011. So, the UK has a history of riots. These have happened, throughout the history, of the previous century. Reoccurrent feature of urban life, particularly in the post-war period in London. The 2011 riots had some kind of socially kind of similar ingredients as previous riots in the 1980s. Just after a real economic downturn, there was high unemployment, rising inequality, and a right-wing government in place at the time. There was also ethnic tensions, and racialised conflicts with police were a common underlying issue. So again, this harks back to the kind of flashpoint model, and I should have pointed out there that the flashpoint model doesn't talk about how protests or riots are flashpoints. It's a kind of critique of that idea that they just kind of spontaneously happen. There tends to be these kind of social ingredients that kind of play a role in when and where and how these things happen. So again, there's kind of list of social ingredients here that seem to mean that it's more likely that something like a large-scale protest or a riot is going to occur, and it tends to move beyond the idea that it's just a bunch of angry, people just spontaneously being violent. There tends to be some proper social underlying causes for it. So in terms of the English riots specifically, they were sparked, in some ways by a flashpoint, but, there was a reliance of these kind of underlying things going on before it for this kind of spark to catch a blaze. There was a shooting in, in northwest London, up near Tottenham, of a young man called Mark Duggan, and this kind of sparked a reaction because there was kind of ongoing racial tensions between the police and local kids there. And then this kind of large-scale thing happens, and all of a sudden, places with similar kind of social ingredients throughout Britain reacted and got on the streets as well, and similar things were happening. So it kind of spread around in a way to areas of particular cities that were experiencing similar social relations. So it went on for 4 nights. There was, large protests in London, Birmingham, Bristol, and Manchester, mostly in the poorer neighbourhoods, and you can see the stats there about what happened: 5 deaths, over 3,000 arrests, 1,000 charges, estimated $200 million worth of property damage. So, what are some of the sociological understandings of what's going on in these things? One analysis by Newburn talks about speed and malleability, expressions of discontent, consumerism. So in terms of speed and malleability, one of the aspects we need to take into account when something like a large-scale protest or riot happens is the role of social media and technology. We can use our phones and social media platforms to organise things very quickly. Can use Google Maps to send people to certain places and all that kind of thing. Importantly, though, what happens is that those technologies can also be used as kind of disciplinary techniques by police or the government or whatever. You can see in the thing up there that BlackBerry apparently started cooperating with authorities to kind of help out to bust people. Certainly in the uprisings in Egypt, the mobile phone companies started working with governments to help find people. So you can see here there's a kind of ambivalence about what the usefulness of these kind of technologies in something like this. They help organise, but they also help find and control. The second thing is expressions of discontent, and I've kind of gone through those already. Tends to be rising inequalities, rising racial tensions, lack of jobs, and more often than not, a kind of overtly kind of conservative government that doesn't seem to be addressing these problems. The third thing that Newburn talks about is the idea of consumerism. What often happens now in these large-scale things is there ends up being looting of shops. Things like phones and games and shoes and stuff like that, but also there was evidence that people were kind of going to white goods places and like stealing more mundane everyday stuff. So consumerism comes part of these things as well. But again, from a sociological perspective, it's debated how much we need to think of consumerism as an issue here. Certainly seems to be expressed in terms of looting in some ways, but in terms of other analysis, this is just kind of the almost like protesting expression of those previous kind of social problems. And I'll go into that in some more detail now. So some analysis were really kind of talking up this kind of idea that these riots were about consumerism. People like Zizek and Bauman wrote some pieces about it. Zizek talked about how this is violent consumerism sparked from the systemic violence of capitalism itself. So you can see there, even in this Zizek's idea, that like the way that the protest seemed to be expressed was in terms of kind of grabbing stuff. He's still talking about it in that manner as a way of protesting against the inequalities and alienation and exploitation of capitalism itself. For Bauman, Zygmunt Bauman talked about the riots were expressions by defective and disqualified consumers. Again, people largely without the means to consume, legitimately. Treadwell talks about there was in these kind of protests, there was an absence of unifying politics. There was embedded unemployment, deep sense of inertia by the participants, and what he calls competitive individualism. And this is again expressed by kind of going and getting the best consumer goods in the looting process. He talks about this as kind of fetishized extreme experience, and you can relate this back to some of the things I was talking about in terms of risk taking as well. For Treadwell, and I'll just kind of read this quote out, with the police temporarily caught short, the brief breakdown of order carved out a lawless space in which the rioters could have acted out their darkest or indeed their most deeply political impulses. Yet for most of those involved, the limit of their desires extended to no further than the accumulation of consumer culture's symbolic objects. So these kind of analyses kind of highlight the consumer aspect of what's going on when riots turn into looting. Others kind of question how to make consumerism as a kind of central motivation in something like this. So another paper on this kind of argued that the riots were actually intensely political acts. Regardless of their apparent spontaneity, they really kind of flow from prolonged experiences of inequality, discrimination, police targeting and violence, and status frustration, a concept that goes back to the Chicago School in the 1950s. For Akram, living in a kind of part of society where that's the norm, it produces a habitus that the past affects the rioters' present, thereby leading to a coming to the surface of underlying political grievances. So the kind of apparent spontaneity of kind of taking part in a riot or looting or whatever, for Akram is actually the product of a long history of experiences of inequality, of feeling of status denigration and all these kind of things. For Newbern kind of says that, in some ways, the consumer thing is kind of important, but it's important then if you're going to take in consumerism into context in terms of a riot or looting, it's important not to see it as a non-political act. So again, I'll just read this out as well. Newbern and his co-authors argue that it is important not to overstate the extent to which the riots were a departure from previous outbreaks of civil disorder. Violent consumerism having a quite lengthy history, so he's kind of pointing out here that the 2011 riots weren't that special in that regard. Second, using testimony from those involved, so there's actual ethnographic and interview research here. We argue that the focus on looting risks ignoring both the political character of the violence involved in the riots. Finally, and relatedly, we suggest that the focus on consumption potentially simplifies the nature of looting itself by underestimating its political and expressive characteristics. In this sense, if we're thinking about going back to bricolage, that looting is a kind of form of bricolage. It's kind of inverting consumerism itself and kind of using that kind of destruction of property as a way of expressing grievance. What's interesting too about the London riots is that there was pretty much a kind of instance of public sociology happened around it, where the London School of Economics, in partnership with The Guardian, produced some reports and some videos called Reading the Riots. So I've got some links to that there if you want to check that out. Series of news articles, research reports and academic publications. They talked about opportunism, perceived social justice, deprivation and frustration with the police as being the main causes. And there's been some criticism of this kind of public sociology version as well, that it wasn't as kind of critical as it should have been. But it was actually good to see sociologists, making some public impact here. So if you're interested in reading more about that, check out those links there. Okay, I'll leave it there and come back and talk about gangs, stigma, and class.